Victor Harper sat in his small yet meticulously arranged home office, the soft hum of his computer blending with the faint laughter of his 4-year-old daughter Lila, echoing from the living room. Life, to any outsider, appeared idyllic. He had a successful career as a graphic designer, a beautiful wife, Camille, who worked as an art curator, and a spirited daughter who filled the house with joy. Willow Ridge, their quiet town, was a sanctuary of routine and comfort, and Victor cherished it. Yet, beneath the veneer of perfection, unease was beginning to stir. It started subtly: Camille's late nights at the gallery, her preoccupation with Gareth Miller's upcoming exhibit, and the way her once effusive conversations with Victor had turned into clipped responses. Victor told himself it was the pressure of her work. He wanted to believe it, but doubts began to creep in like shadows on a cloudy day. That evening, as Victor tucked Lila into bed, he felt the weight of his concerns pressing harder than ever. Lila clung to her favorite stuffed bear, her small voice carrying the innocent question, "Daddy, will Mommy read me a story tomorrow?" Victor hesitated before brushing her curls from her forehead. "Of course, sweetheart. Mommy's just very busy right now." The truth stung. Camille's absence was becoming more frequent and Lila's disappointment more palpable. He kissed her goodnight, his chest tightening as her eyelids fluttered closed. In the kitchen, Camille was pouring herself a glass of wine, her movements measured and distant. Victor joined her, hoping for a moment of connection. "Busy day at the gallery?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She nodded without looking up, swirling the crimson liquid in her glass. "You know how it is. Gareth's pieces require so much attention. The donors are demanding, too." Victor studied her face, searching for the warmth that had once lit up her eyes when she spoke about her work. "You've been working late a lot lately," he said, his voice edged with concern. Camille's gaze snapped to his, defensive. "Is it a crime to be dedicated to my career, Victor? I thought you'd understand that." The sharpness in her tone cut through him. He raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just miss you, Camille. We miss you." Her features softened for a fleeting moment, but she quickly turned away. "I'm going to bed. Good night." Victor stood alone in the kitchen, the sound of her retreating footsteps echoing in his ears. He leaned against the counter, staring into the darkness of the backyard. Something was wrong. He felt it in his bones. That night, as he lay in bed, Camille's side felt colder than usual. He stared at the ceiling, replaying their recent exchanges, the distance, the defensiveness. Was it him? Had he failed to notice the cracks forming in their marriage? The next morning, Victor's resolve hardened. If there was something lurking beneath the surface, he needed to uncover it. For himself, for Lila, for the life they had built together. As Camille hurried out the door with barely a goodbye, Victor knelt by Lila, who was coloring at the kitchen table. "How about pancakes for breakfast today, kiddo?" Lila's face lit up with a grin. "Yay! Extra syrup, please." Victor smiled, savoring the simple joy in her reaction. As he flipped pancakes, he promised himself that no matter what he uncovered, Lila would never feel the weight of his suspicions. She deserved the best of him, even if his world was beginning to unravel. Victor Harper sat in his studio late one evening, the faint glow of his computer screen casting long shadows on the walls. The design files on his screen blurred as his thoughts drifted back to the hollow exchanges with Camille earlier that day. Her voice, once filled with warmth and shared dreams, now carried a tone that felt distant, almost mechanical. He rubbed his temples, forcing himself to focus, but the gnawing unease wouldn't let go. The question repeated like a haunting refrain. What was happening to them? The sound of small feet pattering against the hardwood floors pulled him from his thoughts. Lila appeared in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear. "Daddy, I had a bad dream." Her voice quivered as she rubbed her sleepy eyes. Victor scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here." As he rocked her gently, he couldn't help but think about the fractured home she might be waking up to. It terrified him. Lila was the glue that held him together, the beacon in his life that reminded him of the family they had once been. The next morning, Camille rushed through the kitchen, keys jangling in one hand while she balanced her phone in the other. "I'll be back late tonight," she said flatly, not even sparing him a glance. Victor put down his coffee mug. "Camille, wait." Her shoulders tensed before she turned, the irritation on her face poorly concealed. "What is it, Victor? I'm in a hurry." "I know you're busy, but we haven't really talked lately. Can we have dinner together tomorrow? Just us?" He searched her face for any sign of enthusiasm, but her expression remained guarded. "I don't know," she said after a pause. "Gareth wants us to finalize the gallery layout by Thursday. I'll see if I can fit it in." Gareth again. The name felt like an unwelcome guest in their home, always present, yet never seen. Victor managed a nod. "Okay, let me know." As she left, the emptiness she left behind felt suffocating. Lila sat at the table coloring, blissfully unaware. "Look, Daddy, it's us!" she exclaimed, holding up a crayon drawing of their family. 3 figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun, smiling. Camille's figure, however, was slightly removed from the others. Victor's throat tightened. "It's beautiful, Lila," he said softly, ruffling her hair. Later that day, he found himself scrolling through their shared calendar on his phone, noticing the increasing number of evenings marked gallery or meeting with Gareth. A pang of doubt hit him harder than he expected. Were these really just work commitments, or was there more beneath the surface? That night, as he cleared the dinner table alone after putting Lila to bed, he decided to text Camille. "Missing you. Let's talk tonight if you're not too busy." The hours dragged on without a response. When she finally returned home after midnight, her perfume lingered in the air before she did. She slipped upstairs without a word, leaving Victor with an unshakable sense of isolation. The next morning he called his longtime friend and confidant, Thomas. Do you think I'm overthinking things?" he asked, the uncertainty clear in his voice. Thomas paused on the other end. "Victor, you know Camille better than anyone. If something feels wrong, maybe it's time to start paying attention." The words echoed in Victor's mind long after the call ended. That evening, as he stood in Lila's room watching her sleep, he resolved to find out the truth. Whatever it was, he owed it to himself and to Lila to face it head on. Victor Harper stared at the empty side of his bed, the faint scent of Camille's perfume still lingering in the air. It wasn't comforting anymore. It was haunting. Nights like this had become too familiar. Her absence, her aloofness, the quiet thud of her footsteps as she slipped in after midnight, always careful not to wake him. It wasn't the life they'd built together. It was something fractured. The next morning, as Victor prepared breakfast for Lila, she sat at the table swinging her legs, humming a tune from her favorite cartoon. "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy eat breakfast with us anymore?" she asked, her big brown eyes looking up at him. The question hit Victor like a cold wave. "She's very busy with work right now, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "But she loves you very much." Lila nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. Victor poured syrup over her pancakes, his mind racing. Was he lying to her, or to himself? Later that afternoon, while organizing his studio, Victor stumbled upon an old family photo. It was taken just a year ago on a summer trip to the lake. Camille's smile in the picture was wide, her arms wrapped around him and Lila. She looked happy. The contrast between that moment and the present felt jarring. What had changed so drastically? Victor's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Camille, her message curt. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up." He clenched the phone tightly, a wave of frustration washing over him. He'd had enough of the unanswered questions, the distant behavior, the hollow excuses. It was time to stop guessing and start finding answers. That evening, as he scrolled through online forums, an idea began to form. It wasn't something he ever imagined doing, but his gut told him it was necessary. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "Best nanny cams for home security." The next day, while Lila was at preschool, Victor visited a small electronics store on the edge of town. The clerk showed him a discreet model that looked like an ordinary clock. "It's great for peace of mind," the clerk said, oblivious to Victor's inner turmoil. Victor nodded, making the purchase with a heavy heart. On the drive home, doubts plagued him. Was this the right thing to do? Was he betraying her trust, or simply protecting himself and his daughter? That evening, with Lila asleep and the house quiet, Victor installed the camera in the living room, ensuring it was hidden among the bookshelves. As he adjusted the angle, his hands trembled. He hated what he was doing, but he hated the uncertainty even more. Camille returned home late again, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She murmured a half-hearted greeting before disappearing upstairs. Victor sat on the couch, staring at the clock, which now held more weight than he ever thought possible. The first night passed uneventfully, but Victor couldn't shake the feeling that the camera was now a silent witness to the truth he feared. 2 days later, while reviewing the footage, Victor's breath caught. Camille wasn't alone. A man, a stranger, stood in their living room, laughing softly as she handed him a glass of wine. They were too close, their conversation too intimate. Victor paused the video, his heart pounding as a cold dread settled over him. He closed his laptop, his mind racing. It was no longer a question of suspicion. He had his answer. The woman he loved was slipping away, and now he knew why. Victor Harper sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paused video on his laptop. The man in the recording, tall, sharp-featured, with an easy smile, looked completely at ease in Victor's home. And Camille? She seemed alive in a way he hadn't seen in months. The laughter, the casual touches, the way she leaned into him. It all felt like a cruel mockery of the life they had once built together. His chest tightened as the enormity of it all sank in. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a dismantling of everything he believed about his marriage, his family, his place in their lives. Lila's laughter echoed from the living room, snapping Victor back to the present. He quickly closed the laptop, his heart pounding. She didn't need to see this. She didn't deserve to feel the weight of something so broken. Later that night, as Lila slept soundly in her bed, Victor returned to the footage, determined to uncover every detail. The timestamps told a story he didn't want to read. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Gareth, he remembered Camille mentioning that name countless times, had been in their home multiple nights over the past month. Victor rewound and replayed every interaction, his stomach churning as the evidence piled up. Each new video felt like a dagger, but it was the little things that hurt the most. Camille pouring Gareth a glass of wine in the glasses they'd picked out together for their anniversary. Her laughter, soft and genuine, echoing in the room that had once been filled with their own. Victor couldn't sleep. He paced the kitchen, his mind racing between anger and despair. How long had this been going on? Was Lila ever in the house while Gareth was here? The thought made him nauseous. By morning, the weight of his sleepless night pressed heavily on him. As he poured Lila's cereal, his hands shook. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, her small face full of concern. Victor forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." But he wasn't fine. He was unraveling. He decided he needed more than just the recordings. He searched Camille's drawers, her workspace, her bag, anything that might confirm what he already knew but couldn't accept. It felt wrong, invasive, but he couldn't stop himself. He found receipts, expensive dinners at places they never went together, a hotel bill tucked into a pocket, and a small velvet jewelry box with a bracelet he had never seen her wear. Every discovery was another crack in the fragile dam holding back his emotions. When Camille came home that evening, Victor's anger simmered just below the surface. She breezed through the door, her phone in hand, barely acknowledging him. "Long day," she said absently, heading for the stairs. "Camille." His voice was calm, but it stopped her in her tracks. She turned, her expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "What is it, Victor?" He held her gaze, the weight of everything he'd uncovered bearing down on him. "Who is Gareth?" Her face froze. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of panic before she quickly masked it. "He's just a colleague, Victor. Why are you asking me that?" The lie felt like a slap. "A colleague? That's what you call someone you bring into our home, pour wine for, laugh with like—" His voice cracked, the pain breaking through his composure. "Like he's part of this family?" Camille's eyes widened, her mask slipping. "You've been spying on me?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. Victor took a step closer, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Don't make this about me, Camille. I'm not the one who broke our vows." For a moment the room was silent except for the sound of Lila's laughter drifting faintly from upstairs. Camille looked away, her jaw tightening. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. Victor felt the ground beneath him give way. Her words, quiet and small, confirmed everything. The silence in the living room was suffocating. Victor Harper sat at the edge of the couch, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Camille stood by the window, her back turned, as if the view outside could shield her from the storm brewing within. "Say something," Victor demanded, his voice breaking the heavy quiet. Camille remained motionless, her reflection in the glass betraying no emotion. Finally she turned, her arms crossed. "I don't know what you want me to say, Victor. You've already made up your mind about me." Victor's breath hitched and he stood, closing the distance between them. "Made up my mind? Camille, I caught you, in our home, with him. What more is there to decide?" She flinched but didn't retreat. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't plan for this to happen." Victor laughed bitterly, the sound foreign to his own ears. "Didn't plan for it? So what was it? A spur-of-the-moment decision? A let's destroy my family today kind of plan?" "Stop it!" she snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "You think I wanted this? Do you think I don't know what I'm risking?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Victor took a step back, shaking his head. "Then why, Camille? Why him? Why us? What was missing here that you had to go and find? There?" She hesitated, her defenses faltering. "It's not about you, Victor. It's about me. Gareth. He sees me in a way you don't anymore. He makes me feel alive." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Victor's jaw tightened as he struggled to contain the swell of anger and despair. "Alive?" he repeated, his voice low. "Do you know what makes me feel alive? Watching Lila's face light up when she sees us together, building a life with you, loving you." Camille's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I loved you too, Victor. I still do. But it's different now. I can't explain it." Victor turned away, pacing the room in frustration. "This isn't love, Camille. Love doesn't look like betrayal. It doesn't look like this." She took a deep breath, her voice steadying. "I didn't come into this marriage to hurt you, but I can't undo what's already happened. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Victor stopped pacing, his shoulders stiffening as he slowly turned to face her. "You want a divorce?" he repeated, his tone icy. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to fight anymore. I want to move on. Gareth is leaving for Paris at the end of the month and I'm going with him." Victor stared at her, a cold fury building in his chest. "You think you can just walk away? Leave me with Lila while you chase some fantasy with him?" "I'm not abandoning her," Camille said defensively. "I'll still be in her life." Victor's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Her life? Camille, you've barely been a part of it these past few months. You don't get to swoop in and out when it's convenient for you." She faltered, her tears falling faster now. "I'm sorry, Victor. I never meant to hurt you or Lila. But it's what I need." Victor stood motionless, the weight of her words crushing him. He felt like a stranger in his own life, the foundation of everything he had built crumbling beneath his feet. "You're not the woman I married," he said quietly, the fight leaving his voice. "But if this is what you want, I won't stop you. Just don't expect me to make it easy." Camille opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her words failing her. The distance between them was more than just physical now. It was insurmountable. Victor Harper sat at the dining table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The early morning light streamed through the curtains, illuminating the empty chair across from him, the place where Camille used to sit. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed his life in the past weeks. Upstairs, Lila was still asleep, her small form curled up under a blanket adorned with cartoon characters. Victor had checked on her twice already that morning, watching her peaceful expression as she dreamed. She was his anchor now, the reason he had to hold it all together. The divorce papers sat unopened on the counter. He had avoided them for days, as though ignoring their presence could somehow stall the inevitable. But he knew better. Camille was gone, not just physically but emotionally, mentally. The woman he once loved had made her choice, and now he had to make his. He stood and walked to the counter, picking up the envelope. The weight of it felt heavier than it should. Slowly, he opened it, his eyes scanning the cold, legal language that outlined the end of his marriage. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to keep reading. When he reached the section about custody, his grip on the paper tightened. Camille wanted shared custody. The audacity of it made his stomach churn. "She barely knows Lila anymore," he muttered to himself, his voice low and bitter. A small voice startled him. "Daddy?" Victor turned to see Lila standing in the doorway, her teddy bear dangling from one hand. Her hair was messy from sleep, and her eyes were filled with concern. "Why are you sad?" she asked, her voice soft. He crouched down, setting the papers aside as he pulled her into a hug. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," he lied. "I'm just thinking about a lot of things." Lila pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "Is Mommy coming home today?" Victor's throat tightened. He had prepared for this question, but still wasn't ready to answer it. "No, baby. Mommy isn't coming home." Her lower lip quivered and tears filled her eyes. "Why not? Did I do something bad?" Victor's heart broke. No, Lila. You didn't do anything wrong. Mommy loves you very much. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices, and this is one of those times." Lila sniffled, burying her face in his shoulder. "I don't want her to go." Victor held her tightly, his own tears threatening to spill over. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Later that day, as Lila napped, Victor sat at his desk, staring at a blank screen. Work used to be his escape, his sanctuary. But now every task felt monumental. He had to keep his business running, not just for himself, but for Lila. She deserved stability, and he was determined to provide it. The sound of the doorbell startled him. Opening it, he found Walter and Elaine, Camille's parents, standing on the porch. Their faces were lined with worry, and Elaine held a casserole dish. "We heard," Walter said simply, his voice heavy with regret. "We're so sorry, Victor." Victor stepped aside to let them in. As they sat together in the living room, Elaine's eyes welled with tears. "We had no idea she was so unhappy. If we had known, it wouldn't have changed anything," Victor interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. "She made her choice." Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. "Victor, you're a good man. Lila's lucky to have you, and so are we. Whatever you need, we're here." Their words, though kind, felt like both a balm and a reminder of how fractured his world had become. As the day wore on, Victor began to realize that rebuilding his life wouldn't happen overnight. But for Lila, for the family he still had, he would start picking up the pieces, one day at a time. Victor Harper stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a plate that had already been clean for several minutes. The rhythmic sound of water cascading over porcelain was the only thing keeping him tethered to the present. His thoughts, however, drifted relentlessly to the daunting future ahead. Lila needed him now more than ever, but he wasn't sure how much more he could give. Between the emotional weight of the divorce and the practicalities of running his business, the cracks in his resolve were beginning to show. A knock at the door jolted him back to reality. Wiping his hands on a dish towel, Victor opened it to find Natalie Bennett, Camille's younger cousin, standing on the porch. Her suitcase rested beside her, and a look of quiet determination filled her youthful face. "Hey, Victor," Natalie said softly, offering a tentative smile. "I heard what happened, and I thought maybe I could help." Victor blinked, unsure how to respond. Natalie had always been kind, but they hadn't been especially close. She was younger, still figuring out her own life. "Natalie, I appreciate it, but you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she interrupted, her tone firm but gentle. "But I want to. I'm studying early childhood education, and I've got a light class load this semester. I can help with Lila, give you some time to breathe." Victor hesitated, his pride warring with his exhaustion. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I mean it." Over the next few days, Natalie quickly proved her worth. She brought a calm, steady presence into the house that Lila gravitated toward. Within hours of her arrival, Lila was showing Natalie her favorite toys and asking her to read bedtime stories. Victor watched from the doorway one evening as Natalie sat cross-legged on the floor, patiently assembling a puzzle with Lila. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sliver of hope. That hope, however, came with a heavy dose of guilt. Natalie's presence highlighted just how much he had been struggling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he should have been able to handle everything on his own. But when he voiced this to Natalie one evening, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Victor, no one can do everything alone," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "You're doing the best you can, and that's more than enough. Lila knows how much you love her. That's what matters." Her words lingered in his mind long after she went to bed. He realized that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a step toward healing. As the days turned into weeks, a new rhythm settled into their lives. Natalie's natural ability to connect with Lila brought a lightness back into the home. She introduced new routines like arts and crafts afternoons and dance parties in the living room, which filled the space with laughter that had been missing for far too long. Victor began to notice other things about Natalie, too. Her quiet confidence, her knack for diffusing Lila's tantrums, the way she never seemed flustered no matter how chaotic the day became. There was a warmth about her that reminded him of what family could be, even in the midst of heartache. One evening, as they sat together after putting Lila to bed, Victor turned to Natalie. "You've been a lifesaver," he said sincerely. "I don't know how I'll ever thank you for everything you've done." Natalie smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You don't need to thank me, Victor. I'm just glad I could help." For the first time in what felt like forever, Victor smiled, a real, genuine smile. The pieces of his life were still scattered, but with Natalie's help, he was starting to believe they could be put back together. Victor Harper sat on the porch steps, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He cradled a mug of tea in his hands, its warmth a small comfort as the stars began to flicker to life above. Inside, Natalie's voice carried through the open window. She was reading Lila a bedtime story, her tone animated and full of life, punctuated by Lila's delighted giggles. It was a sound Victor hadn't heard in months, a pure, unrestrained joy that seemed to wrap itself around the house like a protective shield. For the first time in a long while, the oppressive weight on Victor's chest felt lighter. Natalie's arrival had been an unexpected blessing, her presence shifting the atmosphere in ways he hadn't realized they needed. "Daddy," Lila's voice called from inside, breaking his thoughts. He turned to see her bounding toward him, her eyes sparkling. "Natalie says you're the king of tea-making. Is it true?" Victor chuckled, setting his mug down. "Well, I might not have an official crown, but I've been told I'm pretty good at it. Want some hot chocolate to go with your bedtime story?" "Yes, please." Lila beamed before turning to Natalie, who stood in the doorway, smiling softly. "Coming right up," Victor said, heading into the kitchen. As he stirred the cocoa powder into the warm milk, he caught Natalie watching him, her arms crossed casually. "You're good with her," Natalie said, her voice genuine. "She adores you, you know." Victor met her gaze, feeling a swell of gratitude. "I try," he replied, "but I think you've been the one making the real difference. She lights up when you're around." Natalie blushed, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "She's an amazing kid, Victor. It's easy to love her." Later that night, after Lila was asleep, Victor and Natalie found themselves sitting at the dining table, a deck of cards spread between them. It had become a quiet ritual, their way of unwinding after the day's chaos. "You're not bad at this," Victor teased as Natalie played her hand with a sly grin. "Not bad. I'm wiping the floor with you, Harper," she shot back, her laughter warm and infectious. As the game continued, Victor found himself studying her. There was something about the way Natalie carried herself, her resilience, her unshakable calm, that drew him in. She wasn't just helping him rebuild his life, she was becoming a part of it. But with that realization came hesitation. Natalie was young, still carving her own path. She had her whole life ahead of her. Was it fair to let her get entangled in the mess he was still sorting through? "Victor?" Natalie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You okay? You've been staring at your cards for like a full minute." He blinked, then laughed, shaking his head. "Sorry, guess I got lost for a second." "Don't worry," she teased. "It's just the crushing defeat getting to you." They played another round before calling it a night. As Natalie gathered the cards, Victor spoke softly. "I don't know how I'd be getting through this without you." She looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, a small, sincere curve of her lips. "You don't have to get through it alone." Her words settled into the quiet room, echoing long after she had gone upstairs. Victor sat there for a while, staring at the now empty seat across from him. Slowly he realized that for the first time since Camille left, he didn't feel completely alone. Victor Harper leaned against the kitchen counter, the soft hum of the dishwasher filling the silence. His eyes drifted to the living room, where Natalie sat cross-legged on the floor with Lila, their laughter weaving through the house like music. Lila's curls bounced as she spun around, a princess crown perched crookedly on her head. Natalie clapped her hands, her smile wide and genuine. Victor couldn't help but smile too. The sight was so natural, so warm. It was a snapshot of the life he thought he'd lost. And yet, here it was, unfolding before him in ways he never expected. "Daddy!" Lila called, her voice bubbling with excitement. "We're having a royal ball! Come dance with us!" Victor chuckled, pushing himself off the counter. "A royal ball, huh? Do I need a crown?" Natalie laughed, holding up a paper tiara. "We've got you covered, King Victor." He placed the tiara on his head with mock seriousness and took Lila's tiny hands in his. As they swayed to the imaginary music, Natalie joined them, spinning Lila in a graceful twirl. For a moment, the world felt light again, the weight of the past weeks melting into laughter and joy. Later that night, after Lila had gone to bed, Victor found Natalie in the backyard, a blanket draped over her shoulders as she gazed at the stars. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he should disturb her. But when she turned and saw him, she smiled and patted the spot beside her. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked as he sat down. "Not really," Victor admitted. "I guess my mind's just busy." Natalie nodded, her gaze returning to the sky. "It's hard to turn it off sometimes, especially when you're carrying so much." Victor glanced at her, the soft moonlight highlighting the contours of her face. "You've been carrying a lot too, Natalie. I don't think I've said it enough, but thank you. For everything." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "You don't have to thank me, Victor. This is your family. I'm just here to help." "You've been more than help," Victor said, his voice soft. "You've brought something back into this house that I thought was gone." Natalie's breath hitched slightly, and for a moment the air between them felt heavy with unspoken words. She shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "You're giving me too much credit. Lila's the one who keeps this house alive." Victor smiled, shaking his head. "She does, but you make it feel like home again." The vulnerability in his voice caught both of them off guard. Natalie looked at him, her eyes searching his for something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself, the words tangling in her throat. The moment lingered, stretching into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but charged with possibilities. Finally, Natalie looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's late. We should get some rest." Victor nodded, his heart pounding as he stood. "Yeah, good night, Natalie." "Good night," she replied, her voice soft but steady. As Victor climbed the stairs to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was subtle, like the first stirrings of spring after a long winter. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the night's events. He hadn't expected this, these feelings, this connection, but now that it was here, he couldn't ignore it. For the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of hope, and it terrified him almost as much as it excited him. Victor Harper was in the middle of cleaning out the hall closet when the doorbell rang. The echo of its chime sent a jolt through his chest, though he wasn't sure why. Wiping his hands on his jeans, he walked to the door and opened it, only to freeze. Camille stood on the porch, her figure framed by the mid-afternoon sunlight. She looked different, her hair shorter, her makeup subdued. There was no air of confidence or defiance, just a quiet weariness that made her almost unrecognizable. She held a small box in her hands, her knuckles white from gripping it tightly. "Victor," she said softly, her voice carrying a hesitance he hadn't heard before. "Camille," he replied, his tone guarded. "What are you doing here?" She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting past him as though searching for something or someone. "I wanted to see Lila." Victor's expression hardened. "She's at a playdate right now. If you'd called ahead, I could have arranged something." Camille winced, the subtle reprimand cutting deeper than he'd intended. "I know I should have called. I wasn't sure you'd want me here." Victor stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in," he said curtly. The living room felt smaller with Camille in it. She placed the box on the coffee table and sat down on the edge of the couch, her posture stiff. Victor stood by the armchair, keeping a deliberate distance. "What's in the box?" he asked, his voice neutral. Camille hesitated before opening it. Inside were photographs, Lila's old drawings, and small trinkets, remnants of a life they had shared. "I've been meaning to give these to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe Lila would want them." Victor's eyes flicked to the contents of the box, and a wave of emotion washed over him. He recognized a photo of the three of them at the lake, Camille laughing, Lila perched on his shoulders. It was a snapshot of a moment that felt so distant now it could have belonged to another life. "You didn't have to come all the way here for this," he said, his tone softening slightly despite himself. Camille looked at him then, her eyes glassy. "I didn't come just for that. I came to say I'm sorry." Victor froze, his heart pounding. He had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to do with it. "I made so many mistakes," Camille continued, her voice trembling. "I hurt you and I hurt Lila. I can't take it back, but I want you to know that I regret it." Victor clenched his jaw, his emotions a storm he struggled to contain. "Why now, Camille? Why come back here to say this after everything?" She wiped at her eyes, frustration mingling with her sorrow. "Because I can't move forward until I make things right. Even if you don't forgive me, I need you to know that I understand what I've done." Victor sank into the armchair, his hands gripping the armrests. "You broke us, Camille. You didn't just leave me. You left her. And for what? A man you barely knew? A dream that wasn't real?" "I thought I needed something more," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But I didn't realize what I already had until it was gone." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past hanging between them. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice steady but laced with pain. "I can't undo what's happened, Camille, and I can't let you waltz back in and disrupt the life I've been trying to rebuild. For me and for Lila." Camille nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand, I just needed to say it." Victor stood, signaling the conversation was over. "I'll make sure Lila gets these," he said, nodding toward the box. As Camille walked to the door, she paused and turned back. "You're a good father, Victor. Better than I ever was a mother." She left before he could respond, her figure disappearing down the driveway. Victor closed the door, leaning against it as a single tear slid down his cheek. He had confronted the past, but its echoes would remain. Victor Harper stood in the doorway of the living room, watching Natalie as she gently braided Lila's hair. Lila sat cross-legged on the carpet, her small hands clutching a stuffed bunny while she hummed to herself. It was such a simple moment, but it held a depth of tenderness Victor hadn't seen in his home for a long time. It struck him how much trust had quietly grown between Natalie and Lila, and, unexpectedly, between Natalie and himself. "Done," Natalie announced, tying off the braid with a ribbon. "What do you think, Your Highness?" Lila beamed, turning her head dramatically to make the braid sway. "It's perfect. Thank you, Natalie." Victor stepped into the room, a smile tugging at his lips. "I see we have a princess in the house." Lila giggled, running to show off her hair in the hallway mirror. As she disappeared around the corner, Victor turned to Natalie. "You're incredible with her." Natalie shrugged, her cheeks tinged with color. "She makes it easy. She's such a good kid, Victor. You've done an amazing job raising her." Victor's smile faltered, a flicker of self-doubt creeping in. "I don't know about that," he said, his voice quieter. "She's been through so much already. Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough for her." Natalie frowned, standing to meet his gaze. "You're more than enough," she said firmly. "She's happy, secure, and loved. That's because of you." Victor swallowed hard, her words cutting through the cloud of doubt he'd carried for months. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "You've been a rock for both of us." The air between them grew heavy, charged with something neither dared name. Natalie took a small step back, breaking eye contact. "I'm just glad I could help," she said, her voice softer now. Later that evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, Victor found himself on the porch nursing a mug of coffee. The crisp night air was calming, but his mind churned with thoughts of Natalie. She had become more than just a helping hand. She was part of their lives now, a vital one, and the thought both comforted and scared him. When Natalie joined him, her own mug in hand, they sat in companionable silence for a while before she spoke. "You've been distant today. Is everything okay?" Victor hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. He stared into his coffee, then finally looked up at her. "It's just, I've been thinking about everything you've done for us. For me, for Lila. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to repay me, Victor," she said gently. "This isn't about favors or debts. I care about you, both of you." Her words hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. Victor felt his chest tighten, the feelings he had been trying to suppress bubbling to the surface. "I care about you too, Natalie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than I ever expected to." Natalie's breath hitched, and she set her mug down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "Victor, I don't want to complicate things. You've been through so much." "I know," he interrupted, his tone steady. "But I can't ignore it anymore. You've brought something back into this house that I thought was gone for good, and it's not just for Lila, it's for me too." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment Victor thought she might pull away. But then she smiled, a small, hesitant smile that carried a world of hope. "This is scary," she admitted, "but maybe it's worth it." Victor reached for her hand, his heart pounding as she laced her fingers with his. "We'll figure it out," he said, "one step at a time." And for the first time in months, the weight on Victor's chest lifted. Trust was a fragile thing, but with Natalie he felt like they could rebuild it together. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Harper home, casting a warm glow over the living room. Lila sat at the kitchen table, her crayons scattered around as she carefully colored a picture of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands. She paused, looking up at Victor and Natalie, who were bustling around the kitchen. "Daddy, can I use glitter on this one?" Lila asked, holding up the drawing. Victor chuckled, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Only if you promise not to spill it all over the table again." Lila grinned. "I promise." Natalie leaned over the counter, her hair tied up in a messy bun, a spatula in her hand. "Glitter is a big responsibility, you know," she teased, winking at Lila. Lila giggled, turning back to her drawing. For Victor, moments like these felt like small miracles. The house was no longer filled with the echoes of loss. Instead, it brimmed with laughter, hope, and the comforting presence of Natalie. Later that afternoon, Victor and Natalie sat on the porch watching Lila play in the yard. She was pretending to be an astronaut, her helmet a repurposed mixing bowl. The sight brought a smile to both their faces, but Victor's gaze lingered on Natalie. "You know," he began, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what's next for us." Natalie turned to him, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" Victor shifted in his seat, his fingers nervously tapping against his coffee mug. "I mean us. You've become such an important part of our lives, my life. I can't imagine this house without you in it." Natalie's breath caught, her cheeks flushing. "Victor, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Victor smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm saying that I want us to be a family, not just for Lila, but for us too. I know it's not going to be easy, and I know we'll have challenges, but I'm ready for it. I'm ready for you." Tears welled in Natalie's eyes, and she squeezed his hand tightly. "I've wanted to hear you say that for so long," she admitted, "but I was afraid it was too soon, or that you weren't ready." "I wasn't," Victor said honestly, "but now I am. You've helped me find a strength I didn't know I had, and I don't want to spend another day without you." Natalie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Victor." "I love you too," he replied, his voice breaking with emotion. Their kiss was soft and full of promise, a silent agreement to face the future together. When they pulled apart, they found Lila standing nearby, her helmet askew as she watched them with a knowing smile. "Does this mean Natalie is going to stay forever?" she asked, her innocent eyes wide with hope. Victor looked at Natalie, his heart swelling with affection. "Yes, sweetheart, Natalie's going to stay." Lila let out a squeal of delight, running to wrap her arms around both of them. "Best family ever," she declared, her joy infectious. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the three of them sat together on the porch, the warmth of their bond wrapping around them like a blanket. It wasn't the life Victor had imagined, but it was better. It was real, it was resilient, and it was theirs. A new beginning had arrived, and with it came the promise of a brighter, fuller future, one built on trust, love, and the unshakable strength of family. What do you think of Victor and his journey of resilience and rediscovery? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories, and be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. See you in the next story.